The dust clung to her skin in the heat of the desert, a fine layer of grit that seemed to find its way into every crease of her uniform, every seam of her boots, and even behind her eyelids no matter how often she wiped her face. Corporal Rachel Hayes had long since stopped caring about comfort. In the world she had been thrown into, comfort was a luxury reserved for another life, another planet, maybe another universe entirely. Out here, in the jagged ridges of the Eastern Valley, surrounded by insurgents who melted into the rocks as easily as shadows, comfort meant only one thing: staying alive long enough to keep someone else breathing. She was, after all, the medic, the one tagged onto the Navy SEAL team as part of a joint mission, the one everyone knew was necessary but few treated as equal. To them she was Doc, or more often, just a medic, someone who patched holes and pushed morphine, someone who didn't pull a trigger unless it was to signal distress. She had heard the whispers more times than she could count, the subtle tone of dismissal carried in the way the men spoke around her rather than to her. She was smaller than most of them, younger than some, and to their eyes she was there because someone higher up in the chain of command wanted to make a statement about integration. But Rachel knew different. She had worked harder than anyone else to get there, dragging herself through months of medical training, combat preparation, and field simulations where failure meant being cut from the roster. She wasn't naive, she knew she hadn't been welcomed with open arms, but she had earned her place even if they refused to admit it. And still, she stayed quiet most of the time, swallowing the remarks and focusing on her role, because she wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to keep them alive. The mission had begun like countless others, with a briefing in the flickering light of a tent, a map laid out on a crate, and a commander pointing out a cluster of red circles that marked enemy positions. The valley was infested with fighters loyal to a warlord who had been siphoning weapons into the region, arming cells that had grown bold enough to attack convoys on the main highway. The SEALs had been tasked with a targeted strike: destroy the supply depot hidden among the ridges, collect whatever intel could be salvaged, and get out before the insurgents swarmed. Rachel had listened carefully, noting casualty estimates, the likelihood of ambush, and the escape routes. Her hands rested lightly on the strap of her pack, loaded with more medical gear than ammunition. She had her sidearm, of course, but the reality was clear. Her weapon was gauze, tourniquets, and adrenaline shots. The commander, Lieutenant Marcus Raines, a man carved from granite with eyes that never softened, had glanced at her only once during the briefing. "Hayes," he said, his voice like gravel sliding down steel, "stay behind the line. You patch. You don't fight." She nodded, because there was nothing to say, and because she had already promised herself she would never argue for respect. She would let reality decide. They moved out before dawn, the desert still holding onto the night's chill, their boots crunching over loose stone as the horizon bled pale orange. The team was efficient, professional, the kind of silent predators Rachel had only read about in training manuals. They flowed through the terrain with hand signals and short bursts of movement, weapons scanning the ridges. Rachel kept her place at the rear, her eyes split between the terrain and the men in front of her, every step calibrated to match their rhythm. The depot came into view just as the sun lifted clear of the horizon. A series of low huts built into the side of a slope, camouflaged beneath tarps that had been dusted to match the earth. A pair of vehicles sat nearby, and Rachel's pulse quickened as she spotted figures moving between them. The team leader gave the signal and everything unraveled at once. Gunfire cracked, echoing off the rocks like whiplash, and the world exploded into chaos. Rachel dropped low, her heart slamming against her ribs as she scanned for the first call. A shout erupted near the front. One of the SEALs had gone down, clutching his leg. Rachel sprinted forward without hesitation, the rattle of gunfire whizzing overhead as bullets chipped stone around her. She hit the ground beside him, hands moving faster than her thoughts, dragging a tourniquet from her pack and cinching it tight above the wound. The man gritted his teeth, his jaw shaking, but Rachel was already shoving painkillers into him, her voice calm, steady, anchoring him in the storm. She didn't look at the shooters. She didn't flinch when rounds smacked against the dirt inches away. Her world was narrowed to the blood pumping between her hands and the life she refused to let spill out into the sand. By the time she had him stable enough to be dragged back, another shout tore through the air. She pivoted, sprinting again, her lungs burning, her boots sliding over gravel. Another man, another wound, another blur of hands and tools. She lost count of the bullets. She lost count of the curses shouted around her. All she knew was the rhythm of triage, the familiar dance of keeping death at bay, the knowledge that without her they would already have lost 2 men. And still, even in the heart of it, she heard the tone of dismissal in the commander's voice when he barked over the comms. "Medic, stay behind cover. We'll handle the fight." But the fight didn't care what anyone thought. The depot erupted in flames as an RPG slammed into one of the huts, and a plume of black smoke tore upward. The insurgents were not retreating, they were swarming, dozens of them pouring over the ridges with rifles blazing. The SEALs dug in, their fire disciplined, cutting down targets with surgical precision, but even Rachel could see it. The line was collapsing. The enemy was pressing harder, closing the distance. And then it happened. The .50 cal mounted on the team's vehicle at the ridge line fell silent. Rachel's head snapped toward it, her stomach turning as she saw the gunner slump forward, his chest blooming red. The commander was pinned down, his weapon barking at the waves of fighters, his voice ragged as he called for covering fire that didn't come. For one breathless moment Rachel froze. She was a medic. She wasn't supposed to fight. But the sight of the unmanned heavy gun, the sight of the insurgents advancing in a tide that would sweep them all under, it snapped something in her. She bolted toward the vehicle, every step a gamble against death, bullets snapping past her ears. She reached the side, her hands slick with sweat as she dragged the dead gunner down, her body screaming at the weight but her mind moving on instinct. She climbed up, her boots slipping on metal, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would split her ribs. The grip of the .50 cal felt alien and familiar all at once, a monster of a weapon that dwarfed her frame. For a split second she remembered the commander's words, "You patch. You don't fight." Then she squeezed the trigger. The roar was thunder. The recoil slammed into her arms like a beast trying to throw her off, but she held steady, teeth bared, eyes locked on the advancing line. The gun spat fire and death, cutting swaths through the enemy ranks. Figures dropped, sand exploded, and the tide faltered under the weight of her fury. The SEALs glanced up in disbelief, their medic silhouetted against the smoke and fire, her face grim, her hands steady on the weapon that wasn't supposed to be hers. And in that moment Rachel Hayes was no longer just a medic. She was a fighter, a guardian, a storm unleashed from the quiet shadow where they had tried to keep her. The first burst rattled through her bones, and by the time the belt had fed halfway through the chamber, the battlefield itself seemed to change. The insurgents, who had been pressing with reckless confidence, stumbled into chaos as the .50 caliber rounds shredded their momentum, cutting down men and shattering rocks that had shielded them only moments before. Rachel barely breathed as she adjusted her aim, dragging the barrel across the ridge line with a controlled fury she didn't even know she possessed. Dust plumes erupted, bodies dropped, and the wave began to recoil. But the enemy was stubborn. They regrouped quickly, crouching low, firing back in wild arcs. Rounds clanged against the vehicle's armor, sparking metal against metal, and Rachel's chest heaved with adrenaline as she kept firing, her vision tunneled through the iron sights. Behind her, she could hear the shouts of the SEALs, the surprised curses, the brief half-second when even hardened warriors couldn't process what they were seeing. The medic, their so-called liability, holding the line when their gunner had fallen. But disbelief gave way to action, and the men around her surged forward with renewed energy, exploiting the breathing room she carved with every burst. Her world had narrowed into the rhythm of the weapon. Fire, breathe, scan, fire again. The chain-fed belt rattled as it spilled brass onto the ground, the smell of cordite filling her nose, smoke searing her lungs. Her arms ached, her shoulders screamed, but she ignored it, her body working on the strength she didn't know she had stored away. She didn't think about what it meant, she didn't think about what the commander would say, she didn't think about the training manuals that told her never to pick up this kind of weapon. She only thought about survival. Hers, the team's, and the wounded man lying just behind the vehicle, counting on her to keep the enemy at bay. Then she heard him. Lieutenant Raines's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the maelstrom. "Hold it steady, Hayes. Keep that fire tight." There was no rebuke in it, no dismissal, only the clipped urgency of a soldier acknowledging another. For a fleeting second Rachel's heart surged, not with pride, but with a grim recognition. He wasn't telling her to stop. He wasn't telling her to get down. He was telling her to fight. She gritted her teeth and answered with another burst, the heavy barrel glowing red in the rising heat, her sweat stinging her eyes as she swept another line of insurgents off the ridge. The insurgents adapted, scattering into smaller groups, some trying to flank, others ducking low to find firing angles. Rachel tracked them relentlessly, her trigger finger dancing between short bursts and sustained streams, her mind calculating in ways she hadn't realized she was capable of. She knew she couldn't hold the trigger endlessly, she knew the weapon would jam or overheat if she abused it, so she rationed her fire like a surgeon controlling blood flow, efficient and unrelenting. Her training had been about stabilizing wounds, but in this moment she was stabilizing the entire battlefield. A sharp crack split the air, and Rachel felt the sting of shrapnel slice across her cheek. A round had clipped the armor just inches from her head, spraying her with fragments. Her vision blurred with the sudden sting of blood, but she didn't falter. She blinked, spat grit from her teeth and kept firing, her body thrumming with the electric hum of survival. Behind her, one of the SEALs scrambled up to check the fallen gunner, dragging him out of the way, while another moved to reload her belt when it ran dry. Their eyes met briefly, hardened soldier to underestimated medic, and in his look there was no trace of mockery, only a silent agreement. She was part of them now. Minutes stretched into eternities. The depot was ablaze, the huts collapsing into fire, and the air reeked of burning fuel and scorched earth. The insurgents, realizing the assault was faltering, tried one last push, a desperate charge down the slope. Rachel roared with the gun, mowing down the line, her voice breaking out in a raw scream she hadn't realized was building in her chest. Bullets slammed into the dirt at her feet, ricocheted off the vehicle's plating, but she was a statue of defiance, rooted in the seat, unwilling to yield. The charge broke, bodies tumbling into the sand, the survivors scattering back into the ridges. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Silence, sudden and unnatural, followed in the wake of her last burst. Only the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded punctuated the desert air. Rachel's arms trembled as she eased off the trigger, her breath ragged, sweat streaking through the dust on her face. Her hands were blistered from the vibrations, her ears ringing from the unrelenting thunder of the weapon. Slowly, as though awakening from a trance, she climbed down from the gun mount, her boots hitting the ground with a thud that felt heavier than her own weight. The SEALs watched her in silence, their expressions a mix of exhaustion, shock and something else, something she had never seen in their eyes when they looked at her before. The commander approached, his steps deliberate, his rifle still hanging at the ready. He stopped a foot away, his eyes scanning her face, lingering on the blood streak on her cheek. For a heartbeat, Rachel thought he might scold her, drag her back into the role he had confined her to. But instead he nodded once, curt and firm. "Good work," he said. Just 2 words, but in them was a shift more powerful than any bullet she had fired. There was no time for celebration. The team regrouped quickly, tending to the wounded, reloading, preparing for the possibility of another wave. Rachel dropped to her knees beside the man she had saved earlier, checking his vitals, adjusting the tourniquet. Her hands shook from adrenaline, but her voice was steady as she reassured him. The firefight had lasted less than half an hour, but it had reshaped everything. She was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. She had fought and they had seen her. As the smoke drifted into the morning sky, Rachel realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She wasn't just the medic anymore. She was the one who had stood on the gun when the line was collapsing. She was the one who had answered when the world demanded more than she was ever supposed to give. And though her heart still raced with fear, though her arms ached from the weight of the weapon, she knew one truth above all others: the battlefield didn't care about labels. The battlefield only cared about who could stand when everything else fell apart. And she had stood. The desert didn't grant them peace for long. The smoke rising from the depot was a beacon visible for miles, and Rachel knew, as did every man on the team, that more fighters would be converging soon. The radio hissed with intercepted chatter, fragmented but enough to confirm it. Reinforcements were already mobilizing, a convoy rolling toward the valley. Lieutenant Rains barked orders, his tone sharp but controlled, and the SEALs moved with the efficiency of men who had been in this position before. They had to exfil fast. But extraction was still 20 minutes out, and in this land 20 minutes could stretch into forever. Rachel wiped the blood from her cheek, her mind already shifting back to triage. She checked the 2 wounded men, ensuring their tourniquets were holding, packing gauze deeper into the one whose shoulder was torn open by shrapnel. Her hands were slick, but her focus was razor-sharp. She knew that if she let her body's tremors take over, she'd lose the clarity she needed, so she compartmentalized, sealing away fear and exhaustion. One of the SEALs, Alvarez, knelt beside her, handing her fresh bandages. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that look there was no trace of disdain, only grim respect. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. He was assisting her without question, and that alone told Rachel the battlefield had rewritten her place among them. The commander crouched near the burning depot, scanning the ridges through his binoculars. "We've got company inbound," he growled, his jaw tight. "Technical trucks, heavy machine guns mounted. 5 minutes, maybe less." The team cursed under their breath, quickly redistributing ammo, checking weapons. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. They were battered already, 2 down and bleeding, 1 dead, and now they were about to face a fresh wave. She glanced toward the vehicle with the mounted .50 cal, its barrel still hot, its feed nearly empty. Her hands twitched, remembering the vibration that had torn through her arms. She could do it again if she had to. She didn't want to, not because of fear but because she knew what it meant. Once you stepped into that kind of fight, you didn't step back out the same person. But there wasn't room for hesitation here. If they were going to survive, every ounce of strength they had left would be needed. The rumble came first, low and steady, rolling across the valley like distant thunder. Then the dust trail appeared, a long smear of motion cutting toward them. Rachel's pulse quickened as the outlines sharpened. Trucks with mounted weapons, fighters hanging off the sides, guns already raised. The SEALs opened fire at range, their precision shots cracking through the morning, dropping men off the lead vehicles. The convoy slowed, tires shredding, but the fighters kept coming, spilling out in a wave of shouting figures. The commander gave a sharp signal toward the vehicle. "Hayes' gun." The words hit Rachel harder than the explosion of the RPG earlier. He wasn't ordering her to stay back. He wasn't shielding her. He was assigning her the weapon. For half a heartbeat, she felt the weight of that trust, or maybe necessity, but then she moved, climbing onto the mount with practiced determination. Her hands wrapped the grips like old friends and she felt the steel answer her touch. The first truck came into range, its mounted gun spitting tracers, and Rachel squeezed the trigger. The roar ripped the air apart, and the rounds tore through the truck's hood, shredding metal and sending the fighters diving for cover. The vehicle swerved, slammed into a rock and toppled, its wreckage belching fire. She pivoted, dragging the barrel toward the second, her bursts precise, controlled, her arms straining but steady. Fighters fell in clumps, their charge breaking under the sheer force of her fire. Around her, the SEALs pressed the advantage, picking off stragglers, their rifles barking in rhythm with her thunder. She wasn't patching now. She wasn't behind the line. She was the line. Bullets whipped past her, a few sparking dangerously close, but she barely flinched, her body locked into the fight. The barrel smoked, the feed rattled, and still she kept the rhythm, guided by a focus so sharp it was almost blinding. One of the SEALs shouted over the comms, "Keep it up, Doc," and Rachel's chest surged at the nickname, once dismissive, now carrying a different tone, one edged with admiration. She cut down another cluster of fighters, their weapons clattering uselessly against the sand, and the convoy's momentum faltered. What had started as a confident advance turned into a staggered retreat, vehicles peeling away under the onslaught. The last of the trucks screeched to a halt just outside the effective range, its surviving fighters abandoning it as they scrambled for the ridges. Rachel let the barrel fall silent, her arms shaking violently now that the adrenaline spike was ebbing. She gulped for air, sweat and dust mingling on her tongue, her body feeling twice its weight. She looked down from the mount, meeting the commander's eyes. He nodded again, sharper this time, the corner of his mouth twitching as though he wanted to say more but couldn't. In the chaos of combat, acknowledgement was enough. But the fight had cost them. The fallen gunner's body was already covered with a tarp, and one of the wounded was slipping in and out of consciousness. Rachel dropped down immediately, moving to his side, her hands already pulling another 4, her voice low and urgent as she coaxed him to hold on. Around her, the SEALs secured the perimeter, scanning the ridges for signs of another assault. The radio crackled, their extraction bird was inbound, 5 minutes out. It felt like salvation, but Rachel knew 5 minutes could still mean death if they didn't hold. The sound of rotors finally broke the tension, the helicopter sweeping low over the valley, sand and smoke billowing under its downdraft. The SEALs moved fast, lifting the wounded, covering each other as they loaded into the bird. Rachel climbed aboard last, her body aching, her pack blood-stained, her arms still trembling from the recoil of the heavy gun. As the helicopter lifted, the valley dropped away, the burning depot shrinking beneath them. For the first time in hours, Rachel allowed herself to breathe without urgency, her lungs dragging in air that wasn't scorched with cordite. Inside the cabin, silence settled among the men, broken only by the drone of the rotors and the groans of the injured. Rachel sat wedged between Alvarez and the commander, her hands still pressed to the wound of the man fading beside her. Alvarez handed her fresh gauze without being asked, and this time when their eyes met, there was something solid between them, an understanding forged in fire. The commander leaned closer, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Not bad for just a medic," he said, his tone carrying the faintest trace of humor under its gravel. Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, her hands still working, her mind replaying every burst she had fired. She wasn't sure if she was proud or terrified or both. But she knew something had changed. The valley was behind them, but the line she had crossed was permanent. She would never be invisible again. The helicopter thudded down on the forward operating base, its skids slamming into the packed dirt with a jolt that rattled Rachel's spine. The ramp dropped, and the team spilled out, carrying their wounded with the efficiency of men who had done this more times than they cared to count. Rachel followed close, her own pack heavy on her shoulders, the metallic scent of blood clinging to her gloves and uniform. The medics at the base rushed forward, taking over with a practiced precision, but not before Rachel delivered quick, clipped updates on each of the injured. Her voice was hoarse, her throat dry from smoke and shouting, but every word was clear. She stayed long enough to see the stretcher wheels vanish into the field hospital before the commander's voice cut across the noise, summoning the rest of them to the debriefing tent. Rachel hesitated, torn between her duty as a medic and the unspoken order in Raines's tone. Then she straightened her shoulders and followed. Inside the tent, the air was cooler but thick with tension. The map from the briefing still lay across the crate table, the red circles now meaningless since the depot was nothing but ash. The SEALs stood in a loose semicircle, their faces drawn and streaked with grime, their eyes carrying the weight of exhaustion. Raines entered last, his rifle slung across his chest, his gaze sweeping the room like a blade. He didn't waste time on formalities. "We lost Carter," he said, his voice flat but carrying. No one flinched. They had all seen the tarp, all felt the silence that followed when a man's voice was suddenly gone. Raines continued. "2 wounded, stable thanks to Doc Hayes. Depot destroyed. Enemy forces pushed back. Mission accomplished." His words were the kind of summary command reports demanded, clinical, detached. But then his eyes landed on Rachel. For a heartbeat, the silence in the tent grew heavier, and Rachel felt every pair of eyes shift toward her. "She held the gun when Carter went down," Raines said, his gravel voice carrying a note Rachel hadn't heard before. "Not admiration exactly, but acknowledgement. Held it long enough for us to finish the job and live to get out." He didn't elaborate, didn't soften it, but the simple statement was enough. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from pride but from the weight of being seen. For the first time since she had joined them, the team wasn't looking at her as a burden. They were looking at her as one of them. Alvarez broke the silence with a muttered, "Hell of a medic," and a ripple of low agreement passed through the room. No one laughed. No one dismissed it as a fluke. They simply accepted it as soldiers did when reality carved the truth in front of them. The debrief continued, Raines outlining the next steps, the possibility of reprisals, the need for heightened alertness. Rachel listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind replaying the moments on the gun, the crack of each round, the way her arms had trembled afterward. She knew this wasn't over. In war zones like this, victories were temporary, and the enemy was nothing if not persistent. But she also knew something inside her had shifted permanently. The label of just a medic no longer fit, and whether she wanted it or not, the men around her now carried an image of her standing behind the .50 cal, holding the line when it threatened to collapse. After the meeting broke, the team drifted out in silence, some heading for food, others for a cot where they could steal an hour of rest. Rachel lingered, kneeling to roll up the blood-stained bandages from her pack, her hands methodical even as her thoughts whirled. Raines approached, his shadow falling over her, and she looked up to find his eyes fixed on her with a sharpness that made her straighten. "You disobeyed protocol," he said quietly, but not in accusation. More like a statement of fact. Rachel swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "If I hadn't, we'd all be dead." His expression didn't change, but after a long moment he nodded once. "You were right." Then, softer, almost grudgingly, he added, "You saved the mission." The word struck her harder than the recoil of the weapon. Raines didn't give praise lightly. She nodded back, unable to find words, and he turned away, already lost in the next set of decisions a commander had to carry. That night, Rachel sat on her bunk, the dim light casting shadows across the barracks. Her arms still ached, her skin raw from the heat of the weapon, and her ears rang with phantom echoes of gunfire. She stared at her hands, calloused and blistered, and wondered what it meant. She had joined as a medic because she wanted to save lives, not take them, but the battlefield had forced her hand. She hadn't just defended the team, she had killed and killed with terrifying efficiency. The weight of that truth settled on her chest like a stone. She thought of Carter, the fallen gunner, his blood still staining her gloves, and for a moment she felt a pang of guilt for taking his place. But then she thought of the wounded she had saved, of the fact that the rest of them were breathing because she had stepped up. It wasn't glory she felt. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was necessity, grim and undeniable. Morning came with no reprieve. The base stirred before dawn, and Rachel found herself once again moving through routines, checking supplies, repacking her kit, sterilizing instruments. But wherever she went, the looks followed her. Not mocking now, not dismissive. The SEALs nodded in greeting, subtle but unmistakable. One even clapped her shoulder as he passed, a gesture that said more than words ever could. She didn't smile, but inside she felt a quiet shift, a belonging that had been absent until now. By midday, Rains called them together again. Intel suggested the enemy had been rattled but not broken. The depot's destruction was a blow, but retaliation was likely, and they couldn't afford to sit idle. Another mission was already forming, this time deeper into hostile territory. As the details unfolded, Rachel's stomach tightened. More danger, more blood, more chances to prove, or to die. But as she listened, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She knew now that she wasn't an outsider. She wasn't just there to clean up after the storm. She had become part of the storm itself, whether she wanted to or not. And when Rains's eyes flicked toward her as he assigned roles, there was no hesitation. She was one of them. The order came down faster than anyone expected. By dusk, the team was already loading gear into the transport, their bodies still carrying the fatigue of the last fight but their discipline refusing to waver. Rachel double-checked her medical pack, counting every vial, every roll of gauze, every needle. She had restocked only hours ago, but she checked again because she knew in the field a single missing item could mean the difference between saving a life and watching it slip away. The hum of engines grew louder as the convoy prepared, and around her the SEALs moved with a rhythm she was starting to match, their silence not cold now but efficient, their glances toward her no longer dismissive but acknowledging. Alvarez handed her an extra water pouch without a word, and she accepted it, slipping it into her vest with a small nod. It was a small gesture, but one that told her she was no longer being carried, she was being equipped as one of them. Lieutenant Rains briefed them quickly by the hood of a vehicle, his voice clipped, the map illuminated by a red-lensed flashlight. A cache of enemy weapons had been spotted in a canyon deeper into hostile territory, protected by fighters who had regrouped after their losses. Satellite scans suggested heavier arms this time, mortars, possibly even anti-air. The mission was simple on paper. Infiltrate, secure or destroy the cache, and extract before reinforcements could arrive. But Rachel had already learned there was no such thing as simple here. Every mission was a tightrope strung over chaos, and one wrong step could send them plummeting. She listened closely, memorizing the plan, visualizing routes, her mind mapping not just danger zones but triage possibilities, where she could set up, where wounded could be dragged, where cover would hold. Rains's eyes flicked toward her once as he outlined roles, and when he assigned her position near the rear guard, his tone lacked the old warning of "stay back." It was simply part of the plan. That subtle shift carried more weight than any speech. The convoy rolled out under cover of night, headlights blacked out, only the stars above to guide them. The desert was a vast emptiness, broken only by jagged ridges and the whisper of wind across sand. Rachel sat wedged between Alvarez and another operator named Keene, her rifle resting across her knees, her medical pack pressing into her back like an anchor. She felt the vibration of the vehicle hum through her bones, her body tense but ready. The memory of the .50 cal still burned in her muscles, but she had accepted it now. If called again, she would step up without hesitation. She wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. She was waiting for the fight because it would come. It always came. The canyon rose before them like a scar carved into the earth, its walls steep and shadowed. The convoy halted, engines cutting, and the team dismounted silently. The air was sharp with the smell of dust and stone. Rain signaled, and they moved, slipping into the darkness with weapons raised, boots finding purchase on uneven ground. Rachel followed, her senses stretched thin, every shadow a possible threat, every distant clatter of rock setting her nerves alight. The canyon floor was narrow, funneling them forward, and she felt the danger in it. If the enemy was waiting, they would be trapped. Still they pressed on, their breaths controlled, their formation tight. The first shot cracked from the ridge above, and the canyon erupted. Gunfire rained down, tracers slicing the dark, the air filling with the metallic scream of rounds tearing against stone. The team dove for cover, spreading against the walls, rifles barking back in disciplined bursts. Rachel dropped low behind a boulder, her pack thudding against the ground, her pulse hammering in her ears. Shouts cut through the chaos. One man hit, then another. Without waiting, Rachel sprinted to the first cry, sliding beside Keen, whose leg was bleeding freely from a high-caliber round. She pressed hard with her hands, ignoring the bullets whining past, her body instinctively curling low as she worked. "Hold still," she barked, her voice steadier than her racing heart, cinching a tourniquet above the wound and jabbing a painkiller into his thigh. Keen gritted his teeth but gave her a nod, already trying to drag his rifle back into position even as she packed the wound. That determination gave her fuel. She slapped his shoulder and moved again, her boots slipping on loose gravel as she crawled toward the second cry. The second casualty was Alvarez, his shoulder ripped open by shrapnel from a grenade blast. Rachel's hands shook for a split second before she forced them steady, ripping gauze, packing the wound, sealing it with quick efficiency. Alvarez's face was pale but his eyes locked on hers, and in them she saw no doubt, no dismissal, only trust. "Do your thing, Doc," he grunted, his rifle still clutched in his other hand. Rachel leaned close, her voice fierce. "You're not dying here." She sealed the dressing, strapped it tight, and shoved a stim into his arm. Then the ground shook. Mortar fire thundered from deeper in the canyon, explosions tearing craters into the floor, throwing dust and stone into the air. The team was pinned, forced to hug the canyon walls as enemy fire raked their position. Rachel's ears rang, her chest heaving with dust, her hands already grabbing fresh supplies as though her body anticipated the next casualty before it came. Then she heard it, the dreaded sputter of the heavy gun mounted somewhere above, its rounds chewing through stone like paper. The team's rifles snapped toward the source, but the angle was bad, the cover poor. Rains shouted over the comms, calling for someone to suppress the fire, but no one had the position. Rachel's gaze flicked upward, tracing the jagged slope to a perch where the enemy gunner was tearing into them. Without thinking, she moved. She slung her pack tighter, grabbed her rifle and scrambled up the rocks, her fingers clawing at stone, her boots slipping but driving upward. Bullets snapped around her, chips of rock slicing her arms, but she climbed, every muscle screaming. She crested the ledge, her rifle raised, and for one stunned second the enemy gunner turned toward her, his mouth open in surprise. Rachel squeezed the trigger, the recoil punching her shoulder, and the man toppled backward with a strangled cry. She didn't hesitate. She swung the rifle toward the second fighter crouched nearby, firing again, cutting him down before he could bring his weapon to bear. The heavy gun was hers now. She dropped behind it, her chest heaving, her hands fumbling with the controls. It wasn't the .50 cal on the vehicle, but it was close enough, belt-fed and brutal. She swung it downward toward the enemy positions on the canyon floor and opened fire. The roar shook her bones, the muzzle flash blinding in the night, but her rounds chewed into the enemy's cover, shredding their formations. The SEALs below looked up in shock as their medic once again became the hammer against the tide, her weapon ripping through the ambush that had pinned them. Fighters fell, scrambling for retreat, their fire faltering under her assault. Rains's voice thundered over the comms, "Push forward. Move now." The team surged, advancing under the storm she unleashed, cutting down what remained of the ambushers. When the last echo faded, the canyon was silent but for the crackle of small fires and the groans of the wounded. Rachel's arms trembled as she eased off the gun, her breath ragged, her body feeling carved from stone and fire. She clambered back down the slope, boots slipping, until Alvarez reached out his good arm to steady her. "Doc," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with something that sounded almost like awe, "you're out of your damn mind." She gave a weary half-smile, wiping blood from her hands. "Maybe. But you're still breathing." The team regrouped, their eyes on her not with disbelief now but with something else, dependence. She had stepped into the storm again and she had carried them through. And as Rain scanned the canyon, then looked at her with a grim nod, Rachel knew it was only the beginning. The team advanced quickly, knowing that hesitation would invite reinforcements to regroup and trap them in the canyon. Dust still hung thick in the air, and the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder clung to their gear as they pushed past the wreckage of the ambush. Rachel kept to the middle of the formation, her rifle up but her eyes flicking constantly to her comrades, ready for the next scream, the next collapse, the next wound. They had survived the first storm, but she knew battles were never single waves. They came in sets, relentless, one after another, until only exhaustion or precision decided who endured. Rains raised a hand, signaling a halt, and the team fanned out near the mouth of a narrower passage that twisted deeper into the canyon. The map had marked the cache somewhere ahead, concealed in a network of caves, and the silence now felt heavier than the earlier chaos. Rachel crouched behind a rock, her heartbeat steadying, her breathing measured as she kept her rifle trained. The men around her moved with the same disciplined rhythm she had come to recognize, but when Keen shifted his weight with a quiet grunt of pain, she knew his leg was already pushing limits. She crawled to him, tugging at the tourniquet she had placed earlier, tightening it just enough to slow the seep of blood without cutting circulation entirely. "You good to move?" she whispered. His jaw clenched, but he nodded, eyes burning with determination. That was the thing about these men, they would crawl if they had to, but Rachel had no intention of letting them bleed out just to prove toughness. She patted his shoulder and slid back to her position, the unspoken trust between them strengthening with every exchanged glance. Rains gave the signal, and they pressed forward, the canyon walls squeezing tighter, the ground uneven and broken. The moonlight barely reached here, casting jagged shadows that could hide a dozen threats. Rachel's skin prickled with anticipation, her finger brushing the trigger guard of her rifle, ready to snap up at the first hint of movement. It came suddenly, a whisper of stone tumbling from above, then a burst of automatic fire raining down from hidden ledges. The team scattered, returning fire in controlled bursts, their voices low and clipped over comms. Rachel ducked behind an outcrop, her ears ringing with the staccato rhythm of rounds ricocheting nearby. She spotted Alvarez taking cover ahead, one arm still stiff from his earlier wound but his rifle rock steady. His grit ignited her own. She rose just enough to fire upward, her shots cutting across the ledge, forcing one of the attackers to fall back. The SEALs surged forward, grenades arcing up to clear the heights, the explosions shaking dust loose like rain. Rachel kept low, scanning the line until a cry reached her ears, another man down, this time Roberts, hit in the chest. She sprinted to him, sliding across stone, her kit already open before she reached his side. The round had torn through his vest, shattering ribs, and every breath was a wheeze of pain. "Stay with me," she ordered, jabbing a needle into his side to relieve pressure, sealing the wound with practiced speed. His eyes widened with shock, then steadied as the pain eased enough to keep him fighting for air. She wrapped him fast, hands slick with blood but precise, and by the time Rains dropped beside her to cover their retreat into a nearby alcove, she had Robert stabilized enough to move. The firefight dragged into a brutal close-quarters push, the team clearing ledges one by one, Rachel following with relentless focus, patching wounds between bursts of gunfire, her presence becoming as vital as their rifles. At last the canyon opened into a wider basin, the entrance to the caves looming like the mouth of some ancient beast. Heat shimmered from inside, and the smell of oil and explosives carried on the breeze, confirmation of the cache. But so did the enemy's determination. From the shadows, fighters emerged in waves, more organized now, their weapons heavier, RPGs firing into the basin with concussive force that rattled Rachel's teeth. The SEALs scattered to flank, returning fire with deadly precision, but the sheer number threatened to overwhelm. Rachel dragged Roberts into cover, pressing him against the rock, then swung her rifle up, firing bursts at the advancing line. She wasn't just patching wounds now, she was part of the defense, each shot calculated, each movement deliberate. The memory of the mounted gun coursed through her muscles again, reminding her that survival here was not about roles but about action. Rains barked into comms, calling for charges to be set on the cache. Two operators broke off, sprinting toward the cave entrance under covering fire. Rachel's gaze tracked them, her stomach tightening as one stumbled under a hit. Without thinking, she darted from cover, sliding to his side, dragging him by his vest with adrenaline-fueled strength. Bullets snapped around them, but she rolled them both behind a jagged boulder, tearing open his vest to find the wound. A deep gash to the abdomen, bleeding fast. She pressed hard, sealing it with quick foam, injecting pain relief, her hands moving on instinct as her rifle lay across her lap within reach. The man's eyes focused on her, his lips forming the word, "thanks," even as he grimaced. She slapped his arm, forcing a grin. "You'll buy me a drink when we're out," she said, though her throat was dry as sand. Explosions roared at the cave mouth as charges detonated, fire lighting the canyon with violent brilliance. The cache went up in a storm of heat and thunder, secondary blasts chaining into each other as hidden munitions cooked off. The shockwave slammed into Rachel, rattling her teeth, but she shielded the wounded man with her own body, taking the brunt of the debris. Dust and flame poured outward, and the screams of enemy fighters tore through the chaos as their own stockpile consumed them. The SEALs regrouped fast, rifles spitting into the last pockets of resistance, driving them back until silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the groans of injured. Rachel staggered to her feet, lungs burning, ears ringing, her uniform torn and smeared with blood not all her own. Around her the team moved with exhaustion in their steps but relief in their eyes. The cash was gone, the mission accomplished, but the cost was etched into every wounded man she had touched, every life she had dragged back from the edge. Rains approached, his face grim but steady, his voice low. "You kept us together again, Document. I don't say this lightly, you're not just a medic anymore. You're one of us." The words hit harder than any explosion. Rachel nodded, unable to find words, her throat thick, her body trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. As the team prepared extraction, she knew the story of what she had done tonight would spread, whispered from base to base, turning the phrase "just a medic" into a badge of defiance. The order to move came as soon as the last echo of the explosions died, because every man there knew the destruction of that weapons cache would draw attention like blood in the water. Rains signaled, and the SEALs shifted into extraction formation, half carrying the wounded while the rest covered their flanks. Rachel helped hoist Roberts onto a makeshift sling rigged between two men, her hands steadying him as he groaned but forced a weak grin, stubbornly holding on to consciousness. Dust still lingered in the canyon, smoke curling upward, but through the haze Rachel could already hear distant shouts, the unmistakable rhythm of an enemy force rushing to investigate. The team started moving fast, their boots pounding the ground in a measured cadence, rifles angled outward as every shadow and ridge became a potential firing line. Rachel kept near the center, rifle ready but her gaze darting constantly to the men bleeding and limping, her mind cataloging their conditions and how long they could last before medical intervention became desperate again. The first attack came sooner than expected. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, figures appeared on the ridge, silhouettes lit by the moon as rifles flared with muzzle flashes. The SEALs dropped to one knee, returning fire in synchronized bursts, but the narrow terrain funneled them into another dangerous kill zone. Rounds sparked off rock inches from Rachel's head, and instinct drove her to drag one of the wounded into deeper cover, her body shielding his as shards of stone sliced the air. Rains barked orders, his voice calm but fierce, calling for suppressing fire on the ridge while two operators scrambled up the slope to flank. Rachel's heart hammered as she rose just enough to fire 3 shots upward, forcing one attacker to duck, buying seconds for the flankers to gain ground. A grenade exploded near the ridge, sending a spray of dust and bodies tumbling, and the gunfire slackened just long enough for the team to push forward again. They moved at a brutal pace, exhaustion clawing at every step, but the pressure of pursuit drove them harder. Rachel's lungs burned, her throat dry, sweat streaking down her face beneath her helmet. She glanced at Alvarez, whose arm was still bound in blood-soaked bandages, yet he carried his rifle with unwavering focus, his jaw set like stone. The resilience of these men stoked her own resolve, but she knew it was her role to catch them if their bodies gave out, to fight with hands and medicine both. When Keane stumbled, his wounded leg threatening to buckle, Rachel was there instantly, slinging his arm over her shoulder despite the weight of her own gear. "Keep moving," she hissed, her teeth gritted as she half-dragged him, refusing to let him slow the line. He cursed under his breath but leaned into her strength, his rifle still clutched in his other hand. They stumbled forward together until he found his footing again, and Rachel let go only when she was sure he would stay upright. The canyon widened, opening into scrubland dotted with jagged rocks, but the danger grew instead of lessened. Shadows shifted on the horizon, and then the rattle of engines split the night, enemy technicals, pickup trucks mounted with machine guns, racing toward their path. Rains cursed sharply, signaling the team to break into a staggered formation, using boulders for cover as the vehicles closed in. Rachel's chest tightened as the trucks opened fire, heavy rounds chewing through stone and kicking plumes of dirt. She pressed flat against a rock, Roberts groaning beside her as she shielded him again, then snapped her rifle up to fire at one of the gunners. Her shots went wide in the chaos, but Alvarez's didn't. The gunner slumped, and the truck swerved wildly before crashing into a ridge. The others roared closer, tracers stitching the ground, and Rains shouted for the launcher. One SEAL knelt, braced, and fired. The rocket streaked across the night, slamming into the lead vehicle in a ball of fire that lit the desert like sunrise. Rachel's ears rang from the blast, but she was already moving to check Roberts again, tightening his bandages, whispering steady words meant as much for herself as for him. Still, the fight wasn't over. Another truck skidded to a halt, fighters spilling out, rifles blazing. The SEALs met them head-on, their precision carving through the chaos, but the numbers pressed hard. Rachel ducked low, dragging one of the smaller packs into position as cover, her rifle bucking in her hands as she fired bursts at the closest shapes. One attacker lunged too close, his silhouette suddenly towering over her, and she rolled sideways as his shot went wide, slamming her rifle butt into his knee. He toppled with a cry and she fired point blank, her body trembling afterward but her mind coldly focused on survival. She didn't pause, she was already moving to Alvarez who had taken another hit, this time grazing his leg. She patched it fast, ignoring his grimace, then shoved him back toward his rifle. "Still breathing," she told him firmly. "Still fighting." The enemy began to falter as the SEALs pressed their advantage, their coordination breaking the attack into fragments. Rains roared orders, rallying them forward, and finally the last vehicle peeled away, its engine whining as it fled into the night. The battlefield went quiet except for the crackle of fire from the wreckage and the rasp of labored breathing. Rachel dropped to her knees beside Roberts again, checking his vitals, her hands shaking now from adrenaline and fatigue. He was still alive, still clinging, and that was enough to keep her moving. She looked around at the others, bandaged, bruised, bloodied, but still upright. They had survived again, but extraction was still ahead, and danger was never far behind. When the hum of their evac chopper finally reached their ears, a wave of relief rippled through the team. They popped smoke to mark their position, the colored plume rising into the night as the rotor wash grew stronger. Rachel helped haul Roberts onto the makeshift stretcher, her muscles screaming with effort, then guided Keen toward the bird as he hobbled with grit. The others provided overwatch, their rifles scanning the horizon for any last ambush. The helicopter descended in a storm of dust and wind, the crew shouting for them to move, and one by one the SEALs piled aboard, Rachel pushing the wounded in before climbing up herself. She collapsed onto the deck beside Roberts, pressing fresh gauze into his wound even as the bird lifted, her body swaying with the motion but her hands steady. The canyon shrank beneath them, the fires of the destroyed cache flickering in the distance like the dying embers of hell. As the desert stretched out below, Rachel finally let her head fall back against the bulkhead, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Around her, the men slumped in silence, their faces smeared with dust and blood, but their eyes alive. Rain sat across from her, his gaze steady, his voice loud enough to cut through the roar of the rotors. "You earned it again, Doc," he said, no sarcasm, no dismissal, only respect. The others nodded, some too tired to speak, but their looks told her more than words could. She had walked with them into fire, carried them through, and fought beside them as one of their own. As the helicopter thundered toward base, Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to memorize this. The bond forged in fire, the unspoken oath that she was no longer just a medic. She was part of them, through blood, sweat, and defiance, and nothing could take that away. The helicopter touched down hard on the landing pad, its skids jarring against steel, and the crew chief shouted for them to unload. The SEALs moved like men running on fumes, their bodies battered, uniforms shredded, faces hollowed by fatigue but sharpened by survival. Rachel jumped down with them, her boots hitting the ground, her arms instantly moving to steady Roberts as he was carried off the stretcher. Medics rushed in, military hospital staff already waiting, but Rachel didn't let go until she had rattled off every detail of his wounds, her voice crisp, controlled, the words spilling in exact sequence. Only when they wheeled him away did she straighten, her chest heaving, sweat dripping into her eyes. The rest of the team limped behind her, and the base staff looked at them with a mixture of shock and respect, whispers already starting to ripple through the night air. Everyone had seen the smoke rising in the distance, the explosions that had rattled even the walls of the compound. They knew something had gone down and they saw now who had walked out of it. Rachel followed the team into the debriefing room, the bright lights stabbing her tired eyes, the sterile smell of the base cutting harshly after the dust and blood of the canyon. They collapsed into chairs, their weapons stacked neatly, their armor tossed aside with heavy clunks. She sat among them this time, not on the edge of the circle like before, but shoulder to shoulder, her place unquestioned. Rains stood at the head of the room, his uniform smeared with grime, his voice raw but steady as he delivered the report to command. He spoke of the ambush, of the fight through the canyon, of the destruction of the weapons cache, and when he came to her name he didn't hesitate. Medic Rachel Holt engaged the enemy directly. Twice she manned heavy guns under fire. She kept half this team alive with her own hands and dragged us through when we should have been finished. Without her, this mission doesn't come back. The officers exchanged looks, some skeptical at first, then calculating, then respectful. They knew Rains didn't waste words and his testimony weighed more than medals. Rachel sat still, her throat tight, her hands clasped in her lap as if to stop them from trembling. The room emptied slowly, the team dismissed for rest, but the whispers grew louder outside, spreading like fire down the corridors. By the time she stepped out into the night again, she caught fragments: the medic with the .50 cal, the one who held the canyon, Doc Holt. Her face burned, but not from shame. It was disbelief, wonder that what she had done in the heat of survival was already becoming legend. Back in the barracks, the men collapsed into bunks, boots still on, gear half stripped, sleep claiming them instantly. Rachel should have joined them, but her body was too wired, her mind replaying every moment, every shot fired, every life she had clung to with blood-slick hands. She walked out into the night, the desert air cool against her face, the stars sharp above. For a moment she let herself stand alone, letting the silence wash over her, the weight of exhaustion finally pressing in. But footsteps approached and she turned to see Alvarez, his arms still bound but his posture steady. He studied her with a grin, small but genuine. "You know you're screwed now, right?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly. "You're not just a medic anymore. You're one of us. That means every crazy mission, every impossible fight, they'll expect you right there. You proved too much." She laughed once, short and raw, then shook her head. "I didn't want to prove anything. I just didn't want anyone to die." Alvarez clapped her shoulder with his good hand. "Same thing, document same thing." He walked away, leaving her with the stars and the heavy truth that nothing would ever be the same. In the following days, the story spread faster than she could process. Other units passing through the base glanced at her with recognition, nods of respect usually reserved for hardened operators. She overheard them talking in the mess, trading details like currency, some true, some exaggerated. One version had her mowing down a dozen fighters single-handedly, another swore she carried 2 wounded men on her back at once. She wanted to correct them, to remind them it hadn't been glory, only necessity, but she bit her tongue. Let them tell it how they wanted. The reality lived in her memory, the taste of dust, the screams of wounded men, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, the hot spray of blood on her gloves. She carried those truths quietly, even as the myth took on its own life. Command summoned her for review and she stood in the sterile office, her uniform clean but her body still bearing bruises. A colonel studied her across the desk, his eyes sharp but curious. "You understand what you've done?" he asked. She answered simply, "I did my job, sir." He leaned back, lips curving faintly. "You did more than that. You stepped outside your role and saved an entire mission. That changes things. You'll be decorated, certainly. But more than that, you'll be watched." His meaning was clear. Her name would travel upward, into circles she had never imagined. She left the office with her stomach tight, the weight of recognition heavier than the firefights she had survived. The team returned to routine, training and preparing for the next deployment, but the way they treated her had shifted permanently. There were no jokes about her staying back, no dismissive remarks. They checked her gear like they checked their own, asked her opinion on routes, even teased her the way they teased each other, a sign of belonging that felt deeper than any medal. Keane limped into the barracks one evening, his leg wrapped but healing, and tossed her a battered deck of cards. "Come lose some money," he said, grinning. She joined without hesitation, laughing when she won a hand, cursing when she lost, blending into the circle not as an outsider but as part of the brotherhood forged in blood. Yet even as she adapted, Rachel knew the legend carried danger. Expectation could kill as easily as bullets. She wasn't invincible, she wasn't superhuman, and every mission still terrified her in the quiet corners of her mind. But fear, she realized, was fuel. It kept her sharp, kept her hands steady, kept her from becoming reckless. She promised herself she would never chase the myth, never try to live up to the whispers. She would do what she had always done: keep them alive, fight when she had to, refuse to let death have the final word. That was enough. Weeks later, another deployment order came down, and as she loaded her pack once more, Rachel caught her reflection in the dusty mirror of the barracks. She saw the same woman who had arrived here as just a medic, wide-eyed and uncertain, but behind those eyes now burned something harder, something forged. She adjusted her vest, shouldered the weight, and walked out to join the team waiting by the vehicles. They looked at her and nodded, no speeches, no fanfare. But in their silence was the truth she had bled for: she belonged. And as the convoy rolled into the desert once again, Rachel Holt knew that whatever waited out there, she would face it not as the medic they underestimated, but as the one they would follow into fire, again and again. The end.